I make videos and do stuff because I don't see the system surviving. I think the only way out at this point, because criminals have taken control, because there has been a coup d'etat. Personally, my belief is you're not voting your way out of this. Okay, that's not going to happen. The best thing that could happen probably is revolution, but more likely, I just don't see that happening. I just see it crashing and burning.
Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with John Titus. He's president of Bailout Films, LLC. He runs a great YouTube channel called Best Evidence. John has a background in the legal profession and in electrical engineering. This is how he describes his Best Evidence YouTube channel. Best Evidence seeks to chronicle major financial forces and legal changes behind America's last days as a sovereign republic, as the rule of law is destroyed and the American people are disenfranchised and looted in broad daylight. In contrast to mass media outlets that rely without exception on propaganda, comprising innuendo, spin, emotion, cropped or partial data sets, agenda-driven conclusions, expert opinions from people with undisclosed financial interests, ad hominem attacks, all erected on a divide and conquer left to right platform. Best Evidence will present issues based on facts and source data. Hi, John. It's nice to have you on again. The last time I spoke to you was just over a year ago. We spoke about how the bankers took over the world. That was June 27th, 2020. Recently, a couple weeks ago, I received a Solari report. It's the volume 2021, number 1. And you wrote a great piece there called The Going Direct Reset. And we're going to talk about that today. But before we go further, I just wanted to play a clip of a piece by Frontline PBS. They did an interview, something about the Fed, entitled Epic Mistake. And this is what Neil Kashkari, who you've been critical of, says. So I'll just play this before we go on.
There's a growing conversation right now about the Fed's role, about whether it's driving wealth inequality, whether it's driving asset prices into dangerous territory that could pop right in our faces, and whether the financial system can withstand that. I mean, there are these seemingly legitimate questions about being in what seems to be uncharted territory.
These questions come from people who are keen Wall Street observers or Wall Street. I never have once heard this line of questioning from a member of Congress that represents a low-income or minority district. Never once. They come to us and they say, why can't you do more? They never say, oh my gosh, you're just benefiting Wall Street. Raise interest rates because I want to keep Wall Street in check. They say, help my constituents find work. So that's why, I find these questions amusing because I hear them all the time from Wall Street. And these are folks who don't care about what's actually happening on Main Street. I don't hear it from Main Street. I certainly don't hear it from low-income communities. And I've heard all of these questions before.
So, John, you're not on Wall Street, are you? And you never were. So can you?
No, and he never answers the question. The question is, aren't you in uncharted territory, yes or no? And he never answers. He says, I heard these questions before. Doesn't answer the question. The interviewer in that special, which was called The Power of the Fed by PBS Frontline, which aired July 13th, last Tuesday at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. Eastern time, is just an absolute mess. And one of the reasons it's a mess is that interviewer is utterly incompetent. He should have said, I'm not from Wall Street, and I just asked you whether you're in uncharted territory, and you're not answering the question. It doesn't matter whether you never heard that question before. I think he's probably lying anyway. Neil Kashkari is the appointed spokesperson for the Fed to come out and put a happy face on all the money that they're shoveling from the public to Wall Street. And so how does he do this? Well, whenever he's pinned down with a question that's remotely relevant, he just doesn't answer it. And you saw it, just a case in that right there. Never answers the question.
Yeah, and I remember Neil Kashkari, he came out of Goldman Sachs. He was hired by Hank Paulson, who probably used to be his boss at one time. And he was hired to work at the Treasury, I think, managing the TARP program to bail out Wall Street. So I thought that was funny when he said that. But in your piece, the going direct reset. You said that, this going direct reset that started basically in September 2019, not March 2020. You said
Right.
it was the greatest turning point in U.S. monetary history since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. So could you elaborate a little bit on that for the viewers?
Certainly. So the Fed is created in 1913, which consolidates control of Wall Street and central banks over the monetary system in the U.S. So that's obviously a major turning point everybody knows about. What happens in the going direct and the Great Reset really begins in August of 2019 at Jackson Hole. The Fed hosts a symposium or some conference there in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I think it's run by the Minneapolis Fed or the Kansas City Fed, one of those. Doesn't matter. It's where all the financial and monetary bigwigs gather and congregate to discuss policy issues. And at that August 2019 Jackson Hole meeting with the Fed, there's a paper presented by BlackRock, which is going to obviously later turn out to be a very important player in the pandemic. And the paper is called the Going Direct Reset or some such thing. And what it says is, it comes out. One of the authors is Philip Hildebrand. There's a few others, but big names in BlackRock. These aren't
He's
just
the former president of the Swiss National Bank, isn't he?
yes, major players. So it's a headline heavy hitter paper, and the paper says, when we have the next downturn, the Fed is going to need to undertake an unprecedented monetary response to the crisis when it hits, which, as it happened, hit less than a month later. I'll get to that in a minute. And what's unprecedented, the BlackRock paper says, the unprecedented part of the response you'll need is you need to start shoveling public and private money into people's hands. So in other words, when you've responded previously, and the example you used, Mario, was TARP, that's public money. That's money to the Treasury, money from the Treasury. It's all public money. Or if it's from the Fed, with the bailout programs and with QE, back in 08, 09, 2010, that's the creation of reserves, buying assets, principally treasuries, but also mortgage-backed securities from commercial banks. But it's not what I would call retail money. They're using reserves, which you and I and ordinary Americans and ordinary American businesses, do not have access to, simply because we don't have accounts at the Fed. So what the BlackRock paper is saying in August of 2019 is, you need to find a way, Federal Reserve, to get money into private people's hands. And that's in August of 2019. It's like, well, what does that mean? And so lo and behold, less than a month later, the New York Fed, the repo market blows up. The New York Fed steps into the breach and starts pumping hundreds of billions or trillions into the overnight repo market. It seemed like a big deal. I think the cumulative total of money pumped in over the next couple of months, 2 or 3, 4 months, was about $400 billion. But that was dwarfed in retrospect because the pandemic occurred and the COVID-19 and all that. I don't want to go into that hackneyed story. We've all heard it way too many times. But then the Fed steps in and it really starts to buy assets. And it starts really in February of 2020. And what differs this time in the Fed's response to this crisis, you remember the stock market is plummeting, it's the same thing, Chicken Little. The whole world is ending. We need to solve all this stuff and fix all these problems. What changes this time is that the Fed starts buying assets from non-commercial banks, from non-bank financial institutions. And so the threshold question for that is, well, how do you do that? Because the Fed can only create new reserves. The Fed can't put money into your bank account. Okay, can't do that. It can create reserves, but you can't use reserves any more than you can spend Chuck E. Cheese tokens at Home Depot. So the way that works is it sets up a three-party transaction. The Fed is the buyer, and it's going to pay with reserves, but the seller can't use reserves. So what you need is a third party, and the third party is an intermediary or intervening commercial bank. And so the reserves that are created to buy the asset, let's say it's $1 billion purchase of U.S. Treasuries, the Fed creates $1 billion of reserves and doesn't give it to the seller. It hands that $1 billion in reserves to the commercial bank in between the seller and the Fed. In other words, and it hands it to the commercial bank of the sellers, the commercial bank used by the seller. And now the commercial bank has an extra $1 billion in assets. And to counterbalance that, the commercial bank creates $1 billion in an account, in a retail account belonging to the seller. And so if you look at that, and now everybody's happy. The seller has gotten rid of the bond, which is sitting at the Fed. The seller has $1 billion of new bank money sitting at the commercial bank. And the commercial bank is balanced out because it's $1 billion of new reserves to counterbalance the $1 billion liability in the form of the seller's bank account. So the transaction works. But if you step back and think about it, look at what's just happened. There was $1 billion of reserves created by the Fed, but also there was $1 billion of new bank money created by the intermediary commercial bank. So it's really a 2-for-1 deal. And I have a video on that called Quantitative Easing is the Greatest Sham Ever, or some such thing. And you can watch that video and it lays out the mechanics of that transaction. But that's the unprecedented part of the monetary response. That had never been done before. And so what you see in response to the pandemic and what you see in the Fed's response to the crisis is a dollar for dollar matching that for every dollar of new reserves created by the Fed to buy assets, there's also another dollar of retail bank money created by commercial banks. And this is reflected very closely and very meticulously in the report I did. And you can see it in the M2 money supply. The M2 money supply, which is retail money, is going up dollar for dollar in unison with the creation of new bank reserves by the Fed in what I call quantitative easing 2020. And that was called for in August of 2019 by the BlackRock Growing Direct Plan presented at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And that was unprecedented. It hadn't been done before. In other words, if you look at quantitative easing back in 2009, 2010, yeah, there was a lot of new reserves created, but you don't see the parallel creation of new bank money in the real economy. And that's what BlackRock said we need to change. And that was what did change. So that BlackRock plan, miraculously enough, completely anticipated the coronavirus crisis. It was months before the pandemic ever hit that BlackRock said, this is how we're going to respond to the crisis. And voila, poof, ta-da, there's a new crisis a month later. How about that? So that, in a nutshell, is what that report is about.
Yeah, that was quite convenient.
Yes, indeed.
You talk about how the ultimate goal here is control by CBDC, but that eventually even the Federal Reserve will be appended maybe by an international institution like the BIS or maybe even the World Bank or IMF.
Yeah, I think that's right. In other words, let's just take that in two steps. There's a CBDC step, and then there's, which cuts out the commercial banks. And then the next step, I'm telling you, is going to be the Fed itself is going to be cut out. Okay, so let's start with the CBDC. In the present monetary system, the Fed is top dog. Okay, and the reason for that is the Fed cannot be bankrupted. The Fed can create as many reserves as it wants, and you can never redeem those reserves. And that's been true since 1971. Until 1971, other countries could come and say, hey, you know what? This $1 billion in reserves, we want to convert it to $1 billion in gold. Where's our gold? And the Fed, really had to produce something. It had to produce gold, which it can't create itself. But since 1971, the Fed's been completely untethered and completely in control. It can create as many reserves as it wants and never have to produce any other money or any other monetary form to redeem those reserves. Commercial banks can create money too, but they're constrained. Commercial banks create commercial bank money, like bank accounts, out of thin air themselves, but they're constrained. And they're constrained because customers can come in and say, hey, I've got $10,000 in my account. I want cash, or I want you to transfer my $10,000 to another bank, in which case the commercial bank has to transfer, not only they have to get rid of the bank money in the account, the $10,000, that goes to zero, but they also have to transfer $10,000 in reserves, which the commercial bank can't create itself, to another bank. So the commercial banks can be bankrupted, and so they have to answer to the Fed. The Fed's top dog in that system, okay? writers going back as far as Alfred Crozier in 1911, writing books about, the predecessor of the Federal Reserve back then was saying, hey, look, it's easy for the powers that be to come into any bank and bankrupt the bank just by having people transfer money out. That's done all the time. He was quite candid about it. And it could be done. If it could be done then, it could be done now. And that's why commercial banks aren't top dog. The Fed is. But now you come to the question of what happens with the central bank digital currency, and what happens when all the countries get on board with the central bank digital currency plan. And the answer is, well, if you think about, if you step back and ask yourself, let's say you bank at, Bank of America, and you want to transfer the money to somebody at Wells Fargo. It's $1,000. That's easy enough to do at a retail level. You just delete the money out of my account, $1,000, and we credit your account at Wells Fargo, for example. But that transaction has to be settled, because bank money it's a liability to the banks. Okay, it's IOUs from the bank to the bank customers. And so that transaction has to be settled. In other words, Wells Fargo, all other things being equal, they're not going to just take on Bank of America's liabilities for no reason. The reason they're going to take on the liabilities is they know that transaction is going to settle. And there's a lot of ways you could settle the transaction. Wells Fargo, who's doing the transfer, they could transfer $1,000 in cash. They could transfer $1,000, if they agree to it, in gold. They could settle that account in a lot of ways. But the electronic way to settle that account is with reserves. And that's really the function of reserves. It's to settle the liabilities of the commercial banks. Okay, commercial bank money is a liability. Now let's look at CBDCs. The central banks are all saying, yes, the CBDCs will be the third liability on our balance sheet. It is a liability. And so what we want to have these cross-border payments where somebody in the US can transfer money to somebody in Ireland, somebody in Japan, to the tune of, say, $1,000. That transaction is going to have to be settled too, because the bank money itself is a liability. It's a liability to the Fed in the US, and it's a liability to, let's say, the Bank of Japan in Japan. So that transaction, when you send $1,000 of reserves or central bank digital currency, US, to Japan, Japan's not going to take on that liability for no reason. That transaction is going to have to be settled. How is that transaction going to be settled? And the answer is same answer. You can settle it in gold, or you can settle it in a world reserve currency that ain't the US dollar. It's going to have to be something else. But when you hear all these discussions about central bank digital currency, you never hear anybody saying, how are you going to settle those intercontinental transfer payments? How are those transactions going to be settled? And I'm here to tell you that the answer is going to be, it's going to be settled by a world reserve currency that's coming out of, like you said, the Bank for International Settlements or the World Bank or the IMF or something. But it's going to be a reserve currency that enables a top dog bank. It's like the BIS. I'm going to use the BIS as the example. The BIS would then be the top bank, and you wouldn't be able to bankrupt the BIS because it'll be able to issue as much reserve currency as it wants. And the subsidiaries in the system will then be the central banks. And so then you'll have the legal subjugation of the Federal Reserve to the top dog bank, because you're going to have to settle those central bank digital currency transfers one way or the other. And that's one of the things nobody's ever talking about in the CBDCs. But that's how I see this playing out. Now, it could play out a lot of ways. I could be wrong, but the settlement question is going to have to be answered. And it's not even being asked right now.
Yeah, going back to the '08 crisis, you wrote that the '08 crisis, in the aftermath, when they were trying to get the TARP voted through Congress, it was a question of whether the U.S. was going to remain under a system of rule of law and real economy, or whether it was going to go into a cronyism, rule of man in the financial economy based on asset valuations. And unfortunately, they voted for the latter. And going back to Neo Kashkari and what he said that there in that clip, he said that they're trying to help Main Street or ordinary Americans. But you wrote really in great detail how this BlackRock going direct plan is actually a great transfer of wealth from the general public to the billionaire class.
Right.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Certainly. A good question. So let's say you're sitting, I'm going to use CalPERS as an example, or a hedge fund. No, retirement fund's better. I'll use CalPERS. So CalPERS is sitting there and it's got to pay out all these retirees. It's got to pay out all these pensions, and it's got to pay out something to tune. It's got to make like 8%. That's, it's pretty good interest rate it's got to make to support all these people retiring. And so it's sitting there and it's got on its balance sheet. It's got, for example, let's say I'm going to use a $1 billion treasury as an example. And the treasury is not paying 8%. And maybe it's paying 1% or 2% or something really low. And so CalPERS is like, well, what are we doing? We got a problem here. And along comes the Fed. And the Fed would say in this system, hey, we know you got this $1 billion treasury sitting on your balance sheet as an asset. It's not really earning that much money. Wouldn't you rather have some high flying stock like Tesla, right? Wouldn't you rather own $1 billion of Tesla than the $1 billion treasury? And CalPERS would be like, yeah, actually, we were having that conversation the other day. The problem is there aren't too many takers for the $1 billion treasury right now. We're not going to get a good price for it. We'd have to take a bath on it, and we're not willing to do that. And so the Fed would say, well, you know what? Tell you what, we'll buy that treasury from you ourselves, and we'll give you reserves. And CalPERS' answer is going to be, well, we don't. Reserves are no good to us. They're like Chuck E. Cheese chocolates. They're not going to do us any good. How are we going to do this transaction? We'd love to sell the treasury, but how are we going to do it? And the Fed says, oh, we got it. You bank with JP Morgan Chase, CalPERS. So why don't we do this? You send us the treasury, the $1 billion treasury. We'll send JP Morgan Chase $1 billion of reserves, and JP Morgan Chase will add $1 billion to your checking account. And you can do whatever you want with that money. But we think that maybe Tesla might be a good idea. And the Fed may not say that. They don't even have to. But the point is that that's how that asset gets converted. That $1 billion treasury is sitting on CalPERS' balance sheet that they're not going to get any money for. Now it's on the Fed's balance sheet. And in its place, they've got $1 billion of new bank money to do with whatever they want. You know what they're going to do? It's hot money. They need to get a return on it. They're going right into the stock market. They're going right wherever they got to go. Maybe they invest in a new business. Maybe it's a SPAC, whatever. It's some speculative thing that's going to have a high rate of return. That's how the money is getting into the hands of billionaires, because the transactions are so huge. Look, the Fed has added since 2020. It's added something like, since the beginning of 2020, $4 trillion of reserves to its balance sheet, right? $4 trillion in liabilities and assets to its balance sheet. That's a lot of scratch. That's $4 million. You need big players to pull that off. And that's essentially what's necessitated the use of billionaires and big corporations and major banks to pull this off. This 2-for-1 reserve creation is going to create parallel $1 billion of bank money. You need to do that a whole bunch of times, but you need billionaires to do that. And that's what's gone on. It's really fueled a stock market bubble. Then it's fueled the rise in asset prices, which notice that Kashkari never answers. Those asset prices, have gone up. Elsewhere, somebody else, Fisher, I think Peter Fisher, formerly of the New York Fed, says, hey, I'm worried that the asset prices are too high. So you have actually a more knowledgeable member of the Fed, former member of the Fed, acknowledging freely that asset prices are going up. Kashkari is just in there as a punching bag. He's useless. But that's how those transactions are affected. Is you need to have big corporations, big billion-dollar corporations holding big bonds and big mortgage-backed securities so that this can be pulled off to fuel the stock market bubble. That's what's going on.
Yes, and the crisis that we've had in the last 16 months or so, I'm not going to have to name it, has been used as a cover to say that the Fed is helping the general public, but you show in your piece that they're getting crumbs, right? Could you give us an idea of numbers? How much Wall Street is getting in billionaires and how much the Fed is really helping? I think the public is being helped more by the Treasury than anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the Treasury. I'll give you an example. Just take the PPP, which was what I can't even remember what it was. The Paycheck Protection Program.
Paycheck.
It was the Paycheck Protection Program. There's actually two versions of the Paycheck Protection Program. There's the Treasury version, which actually helped people, and then there's the Fed version, which is the window dressing version. The Treasury version of the PPP, which is administered by the Small Business Administration, pumped out something like $600 billion to Main Street. And that's really what buffeted Main Street during the crisis and during what I'll call the lockdown crisis. That's really what tided people over. I mean, I personally know people who benefited from the Paycheck Protection Program as administered by the Small Business Administration. On the one hand. On the other hand, I know no one who's even heard of the Federal Reserve's Paycheck Protection Program. That's the window dressing version. I think it's run out of the New York Fed or maybe the Boston Fed, one of the others. I mean, and they had a big headline number like, oh, the Fed's allocated something like, $500 billion to the PPP or some such, but only a pittance of that was tapped, something like $37 billion, $50 billion maybe. It was a small amount, undoubtedly all of which went to cronies. But all the Fed programs, the Main Street lending program, the municipal lending facility, they're all drops in the bucket. They're just out there as placeholders so that publications like the Wall Street Journal and Business Week can write articles saying, oh, isn't the Fed help people out? Isn't this great? It's just PR. Those programs are just PR. The real work is being done by the Treasury, which is borrowing money to run those programs. So that's, the Fed's number one job. It's not inflation. It's not employment. The Fed's number one job and its number one preoccupation, and they acknowledge this, is public relations. That's all they care about. That the Fed is the biggest public relations firm in the world, and that's what those programs are about. They're not about helping anybody.
And also, they're about keeping asset prices high so their billionaire friends can stay whole, so to speak.
Right. Keep asset prices high, but also it's part of public perception too, because the linchpin, the stock market is the pillar of perception management. In other words, you have a high stock market, everybody thinks, well, the economy's okay. Look how high the stock market is. I think Main Street has, by and large, gotten away from that since 2008, but that's still a major pillar of the Fed's PR program is the stock market. But you're exactly right, Mario. Pumping up the asset prices is a big name of the Fed's game, especially now.
Do you think they're going to succeed in keeping asset prices high? I guess they have
no, absolutely not. I don't. Yeah. And I'll tell you why. If you go back to that Power of the Fed program, that program it's a mess. They don't know what they're talking about 9 times out of 10. But that guy, I think his name is Peter Fisher from the Fed, and you can look at it in the highlights of the program or previews of the program. It's a short clip, and I can email it to you too, Mario. He says, Peter Fisher, and he's one of these guys. Peter Fisher is a connect dude, okay? He's banked for international settlements, worked at BlackRock before, worked at the New York Fed for a number of years. He's a connected guy, and he said, I am concerned that asset prices are getting way too high. And he says, I think there's a really high chance, 1 in 3, of a financial calamity ahead. Okay, that's all you need to hear. A Fed guy of that stature coming out and saying asset prices are too high, there might be a calamity ahead. You're going to hear that quote again. You're going to hear it down the road after there's a collapse, after the stock market implodes. Because remember, every depression in U.S. history, without exception, is created by Wall Street. It's created by the Fed. They do these things deliberately because they short stuff, they short stocks, and they short stuff ahead of time and make money on it. And then when it collapses, they can buy up valuable assets at pennies on the dollar. It's a classic pump and dump. It's done over and over. I feel like Charlie Brown, with the football. It's just how many times does that have to happen before you realize that it's just a football getting yanked out from front of you? Of course, the market's going to collapse. Peter Fisher just told you it's going to collapse, on Frontline,
Yeah,
that's why I think it's good. A collapse is ahead.
I guess the end game is to consolidate wealth even more, because I saw some data, and it's the Federal Reserve Board that issues the wealth data. And I think the top 10% of Americans now own almost 90% of all the corporate equities and corporate bonds. So if we have another crisis, we could see that proportion get even higher. Like they could maybe be owning 92 to 95%.
Right. And we're well beyond where we were at the Great Depression in terms of asset skew, or income skew, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's way out of balance. And it's not, I don't have a problem per se with this guy owns more than that guy. That's not the problem. The problem is the monetary system is a debt-based monetary system. And it creates two classes of people: those who can create money out of thin air and lend it to everybody else, and everybody else who's got to borrow the fairy dust money at interest. It's a ridiculous two-tiered system. It's completely contrary to the Declaration of Independence, completely contrary to the Constitution, and completely contrary to the rule of law. And that's our problem. But nobody wants to talk about it. They want to talk about, the income skew that's a symptom, though.
Yeah,
It's a big symptom of a sick monetary system.
Yeah, it's really unfair that a group of people can create reserves and buy assets for nothing, while you and I and other people have to work hard to earn money, or our own reserves, so to speak.
Right.
I wanted to touch upon as well on BlackRock's road ahead. Well, we've looked at the going direct. That's what the Fed is doing now, and they're probably going to keep doing it, and that's going to probably keep pumping up M2, right? But you also speak about a policy revolution, which is more about control. That's, I guess, got to do more with the CBDCs, but I guess it's a world where, like you said, there's no rule of law, and the bankers are in charge of our lives.
Yeah, and it's more and more that way. If you take a step back to the financial crisis, 2008, and the bailouts, essentially what happened is the banks weren't, they collapsed under the weight of their own fraud, and they basically put a gun to the head of the U.S. and said, "Bail us out, we'll blow your head off." Meaning, and they were correct in a way, because retail bank money is created by banks, and the top four banks account for something like 40% of the U.S. retail money supply. So any one of those banks goes down, and you have a major problem. I mean, by way of example, during the Great Depression, the money supply contracted by 32% over 4 years. During 2008, if even one of those banks collapses, you get a 10% money supply contraction overnight, basically. So they put a gun to America's head and said, bail us out or else. And so the Fed bailed them out, and Congress bailed out the banks. But guess what? I mean, now the criminal's in charge of the system. And guess what else? Banks aren't lending. They have not been increasing lending since 2008. And that's the problem, is the money supply is not increasing, but the economy is increasing, and so is the population of the economy increasing. You need an increasing money supply in a debt-based monetary system, and we're not getting it from commercial banks. They're not lending, which is how money is created by commercial banks. And this has forced the Fed to step into the breach with this BlackRock plan, this unprecedented plan of buying public and private assets, and putting private money in the hands by forcing banks to do what they're not going to do voluntarily, which is lend money to Main Street. And this problem is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so the end run is going to be, to my way of thinking, Central Bank Digital Currency, where the Fed just says, you know what? And we have the two liabilities on our balance sheet now are cash. That's one liability that's physical, and reserves, which is another liability that's digital. We're going to create a third liability called Central Bank Digital Currencies. And now, remember how I said, you don't have an account on the Fed? I don't have an account on the Fed. People are going to start having accounts at the Fed, and the Fed is going to put money into people's accounts directly, and it's going to enable people to spend that money in retail situations. So the Fed is completely cutting out the banks with the Central Bank Digital Currency plan, and they're moving forward with this. And the problem is there's a lot of problems with this, but one of the problems has been quite candidly admitted to by Augustin Carstens, the head of the Bank for International Settlements. He says Central Bank Digital Currency is going to be great, because right now, somebody with a $100 bill, we don't know where they're spending that money. We don't know what they're spending it on. He said, but with Central Bank Digital Currency, we have so much control. We have the technology to enforce the control. I mean, it's insane what this guy says. And if you doubt me, look up the October 2020 Central Bank Digital Currency Symposium. It's called Cross-Border Payments. And Jerome Powell's part of that symposium. And so is Jorge Lina, somebody or other with the IMF. Carstens is a deranged maniac. But at least he's candid about what he wants, which is total control over the money supply.
Yeah, I saw that clip. I think he likes his tacos and burritos as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's not hurting for money. He's not hurting for food, for sure.
Yeah, we saw in '08. I think you did a video about this, that they scared the U.S. Congress, the government, to come out with the bailouts, and they said that Main Street was going to collapse, which you said is partly true, but you explained, though, in this video that it was really the banks that were collapsing, and not Main Street. There wasn't really a problem with Main Street, and but right now, I think we're getting more the same, because I heard that during the repo crisis, there were a lot of hedge funds. Even the BIS came out a few months later and said that hedge funds were in trouble. There's rumors about Citadel. And so it just seems like every time we have to bail out the same people.
Yeah, it's the same people again and again, and because they get hoisted on their own petard and they get tangled up in their own fraud. But the video you're talking about, I did, is called Ben Bernanke's Sovereign Deception. I'm surprised you remembered it. I did it a few years ago. And it's all about how the central bank just uses Main Street is an excuse, like, oh, we got to come in, we got to rush in, we got to save the commercial paper market. And it's like non-financial commercial paper is fine. Not even registering a blip throughout the teeth of the crisis. It's the financial commercial paper market that's always in trouble. But the problem is that you've got this system now where it depends on ever expanding debt and more debt and more retail money created by banks. And so there's more and more players involved in it. And so you have any one of these players topple, and it just sets off a chain reaction of events where you're going to take down a bank, and then you're in real trouble because the money supply collapses. And then you do have a bona fide Great Depression on your hands. I mean, the system it's set up for a Russian roulette game. Yeah, that's what it is. It's a Russian roulette system where they can just take a gun and point it at your head, saying, you know what, you want to take a chance? Go ahead, pull the trigger, see what happens. Take a chance. It's like a game of Jenga with all these big financial institutions, and they all get bigger. Congress could rein in any one of these at any time they wanted. They could pass a law saying, you know what, we're going to reinstitute a rule that says no more than 5% ownership of banks across state lines, and chop them down to size overnight. But they won't do that because Congress has been bought out through this corrupt system.
Yeah, so the system's got even more out of whack since '08. The too big to fail banks are even bigger, and that's a huge problem. Have you got any suggestions of how to survive through this for the viewers? What you're doing personally?
You don't want to know what I'm going to do. I mean, I make videos and do stuff because I don't see the system surviving. I think the only way out at this point, because criminals have taken control, because there has been a coup d'etat, personally, my belief is you're not voting your way out of this. Okay. That's not going to happen. The best thing that could happen probably is revolution, but more likely, I just don't see that happening. I just see it crashing and burning. And, I make videos and try to lay a record so that people who do survive, on the other side, maybe pick up my stuff and figure out what went wrong, but this system's not going to last. You can't have criminals in charge of the system. And that's what we have.
It's becoming more and more like, because I grew up in Brazil, and it's becoming more and more like a third world country where very few people have all the wealth. And like you, I don't have anything against people doing well and making money. But when there's the whole general public is dirt poor and a few people under cronyism do well, that's a problem.
Right. I got a big problem when you've got a gun to my head, and that's how you're getting ahead.
Yeah. What about financially? How are you preparing for this?
It's like the squirrel. I put money in different areas.
Yeah.
Because you never know how things are going to play out. Money here, money there. I mean, precious metals is a way to go. I love silver coins, just because maybe I'm nostalgic. But I like the 90% silver. I think that's a great hedge. I have some money in commercial banks. You got, credit union is a great, just spread it around. You don't know what's happening. And I also live in a very rural area right now. My neighbors are Amish.
Oh,
I don't see this playing out in a good way.
Well, the Amish are, I would say, a group of people that are really outside the system as much as can be. So
yeah, they're as much as can be. Yes.
Yeah.
They like cash. I noticed that. So hold cash too. Be Amish, big cash fans.
So you think the credit unions and small banks would survive, even though the too big to fail big banks have their tentacles all over the place?
Well, yeah. With no rule of law, things get a little tricky. But I can tell you this: I've read a lot on financial history and monetary history. And I've read a lot on the legality of it. And it's like, well, if the system is run by criminals, what's the point of all these rules? And one of the points of the rules is that when things crash and burn, the powers that be need a scorekeeping system. Okay. So whatever monetary system is in place, regardless of whether or not those rules are enforced equally or enforced fairly, they're going to be enforced to govern the disposition of assets. And for that reason, I like having money, not just, I think it's important to have money in places that aren't, they don't create money out of thin air. Credit unions and savings and loan companies, because they're inherently very conservative and very safe. But like I say, the main thing is don't just consolidate all your money in one place. Don't keep all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, don't keep it all with Chase or Bank of America or Wells Fargo or any of the big ones, I would say.
Yeah, you're asking for trouble there. I mean, you see all the trouble Wells is in. I mean, they create bogus accounts in people's names, and now they're trimming credit lines, right? They're using this so sick, our system. They create all these bogus accounts in people's name, which is straight up criminal identity theft, and nobody goes to jail. Now they've turned around and said, we got punished for that. And because we got punished and the punish hurt us so bad, we're gonna have to trim these credit lines and hurt people's credit. This is a criminal system. So I'd stay away from what I would call the headline obvious criminals. And if you got to be with a commercial bank, stick with the smaller one. Not with the big ones. I really think you're asking for trouble with the big commercial banks.
John, it was great speaking with you. I really enjoy that. Maybe we should do it more often. It took us about 13 months to speak again. So,
I'm not exactly Mr. Prolific when it comes to making videos. I'll get back into it here. I've got a lot on my mind. And anyway, it's great talking to you too, Mario.
It was
Good
great
to see you
talking
again.
to you as well. Take care.
Thanks, Mario.
Welcome.